Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us live on the second program of the month with PSU Open Mobility 2021. This afternoon, our invited speakers are going to cover the topic of transcultural communication and global Englishes. In addition, we have Chitima Singyamchit here as our moderator, and I do appreciate her invaluable contribution. And Dr. Chitima Singyamchit is a lecturer at the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, Bangkok, Thailand. She has published and presented internationally on English as a lingua franca, online intercultural communication, English language teaching, and English as a medium instruction. Her recent work involves interculturality of English conversation among international students and transcultural communication in a social network community. She is also a Dutch editor of the book Interculturality and the English Language Classroom, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Now, let's waste no longer, and I will let Dr. Chitima take over the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. So, hi everyone from around the world. It's afternoon here in Thailand. It's nice to see you all today. And thank you, Dr. Assistant Professor Dr. Yusuf, for a very detailed introduction. So I am Dr. Chitima Singyamchit from the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, UTCC, Bangkok, Thailand. So I'm here to be a moderator for today's sessions. So welcome, formally welcome everyone again to the PSU Open Mobility 2021 on the topic of transcultural communication and global Englishes by Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box or directly ask the speaker at the end of the sessions during the question and answer sessions. I believe everyone is very excited and looking forward to Dr. Will Baker speaking talk. And so please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker to run the session. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, good morning from the UK, everybody. It's the early morning here. I guess for most of you in Thailand, it's the afternoon. So good afternoon to everyone in Thailand. Thank you to Dr. Chitima for the introduction. I think it's very fitting that Chitima is giving the introduction. As we'll see throughout the presentation, lots of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is based on the work we did together and Dr. Chitima's PhD study, and then the subsequent work the two of us did together on transcultural communication. So I think it's a very good choice to have Dr. Chitima as the moderator for today. I'd also like to thank Yusuf for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be invited to talk at PSU. I've obviously known Yusuf for a long time, first as my PhD student, and then over the last 4 or 5 years as a colleague, and we're still working together on various projects. So it's great to talk at your university. So thank you very much for the invite.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I'll open up my PowerPoint now and try and share the slides. So let me see if this works. Can people see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So as has already been said, the topic for today will be global Englishes, intercultural and transcultural communication. Has the slide changed okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to talk about kind of 5 different areas today. So I'm going to begin just with an overview of global Englishes, English as a lingua franca, and its links to intercultural communication. Yeah, and here I'll just go through some basic terminology and some of the kind of main ideas here. Then I'll talk a little bit about theory, not too much hopefully, but I think it's important to go through some of the theory because that will inform what comes later when we talk about teaching. So the theory I'm going to look at is what the links between language and culture might be through global Englishes, because I think global Englishes raises some interesting questions about how we understand concepts such as language and culture, and particularly how we understand the relationship between them. I'll then move on to the topic of cultural identity through global Englishes, and I'll talk about why that's an important topic and something that we need to consider. And then I'll come on to the kind of the new theory or the new ideas that I've been working on over the last few years, and I've been working on with Dr. Chittamar as well. So this is from intercultural communication to transcultural communication. So transcultural communication is quite a new idea, but hopefully you'll see when I talk about it in a bit more detail and show examples, perhaps something that you're already very familiar with, but didn't kind of call it transcultural communication before. And then in the final part of this presentation, we'll then go on to the implications for English language teaching. So this is something I've been looking at over the last 2 or 3 years. So what does transcultural communication mean for how we might teach English? Now, I thought what we do today is it's a 2-hour session. Rather than just have me talking for 2 hours, we'd run it like a, well, as Yusuf said, it's a seminar. So we'll run it like a seminar. So we will have me presenting things, but we'll also have some discussion activities for you. And also, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or to, don't know if you can raise your hand, but feel free to ask any questions throughout. And there will also be time at the end to ask questions as well. Yeah, but I want it very much to be a seminar, so people are welcome to ask questions at any point. Oops. Okay, so as I said, it's going to be like a seminar. So I'm going to begin with some questions, which I think are kind of crucial for what we're going to be talking about today. So the main question is, what is the relationship between culture and language? So that's really what we're going to be considering in detail today. Excuse me. And some aspects to think about, or some ways of approaching that, are to think, are language and culture synonymous? So in other words, are they part of the same thing? So does, for example, the English language represent and construct English culture? Yep, so whether that be British or American culture or whatever. Yep, so when we talk about the English language, are we talking about Anglophone cultures? Or alternatively, can language be culturally neutral? So this means that language doesn't necessarily have any cultural content. So when we're talking about English, particularly English used as a global language, can it be used in a manner that does not represent any culture? So in other words, having culture-free language. Or thirdly, do you think the relationship between language and culture is something else again? All right, so before I start talking about that, I'd like you to spend some time thinking about that question and those 3 aspects of it. So just to repeat it, you're thinking about what is the relationship between language and culture, and then can we see language and culture as being the same thing and associated with a particular culture, or are languages culturally neutral, or is it perhaps something else again? Okay, so maybe if we give people 5 minutes to think about that. So I don't know, Yusuf, if people can talk in groups or if they just want to think about it individually.
I think we can discuss here first. Yeah, I mean, and then for the activities, for the regarding the next activity or the handout that you have sent us. So in that case, we can break our rooms for the participants. Maybe okay, for this question, we can discuss here together, I guess.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Maybe then if we give people a few minutes to think about it, and if anyone wants to post their answers in the chat or anything like that, anyone's brave enough to pull the chat up so we can see it. I should also add that people have argued for all of these different approaches, so don't feel that if you say one or the other that you'll look stupid. Now, I obviously have my own particular opinion, but researchers and scholars have argued for all of these different approaches. So you certainly won't be alone, whichever one you pick.
That's right. So please feel free to exchange your idea by leaving your message in the chat box. Great. we have some comment in the chat
Yeah,
from Andrew. There's a few more coming.
Okay, so we got 3 interesting responses so far, yeah, and all 3 people seem to agree that culture and language are linked, yeah, and that language won't be culturally neutral. Okay, well, I think that's about 5 minutes. So thank you to everyone who posted. Yeah, so there seems to be general agreement that cultures and languages are linked and that language is not culturally neutral, although I noticed some different responses to how exactly they're linked. So I'm not going to give my answer yet, but that's something that we'll talk about obviously in more detail as we go through the seminar. But what I thought I'd do next then is to look at an example of intercultural communication or transcultural communication, as I will argue it should be referred to later, to think about some of the relationships between language and culture, and to perhaps think about how we might conceptualize them in the kind of communication that we currently see. So this is an example from, well, it says here Baker and Ishikawa, but it's actually from Tomokazu Ishikawa's research. So he was looking at multilingual students in an English medium instruction program in Tokyo. And here we have a text exchange between a Japanese student, Hanako, and an American student, Hannah. Okay, so both of them speak both Japanese and English, but Hanako's first language is Japanese, Hannah's first language is English. So this is a text exchange between the 2 of them discussing their plans for breakfast. Now, I'm sure anyone who's an English language teacher will be very familiar with the topic of what people eat for breakfast. Yeah, it's one of those kind of classic ELT topics when you want to introduce different cultures. Yeah, you have what do people eat for breakfast around the world? Yeah, and people in this country eat that, people in this other country eat these different things for breakfast. So I thought it was quite a nice example, and it's the kind of topic that's often dealt with in ELT when we talk about culture. So here we've got these 2 people talking about what they're going to eat for breakfast. Now, hopefully you can read it there, although you should also have it on the handout that I also sent round. So I won't read it all out, but I'll just give you a few minutes to read through it now. Yeah, and I'd like you to look at how language is used and also think about what are the kind of practices around breakfast food and eating breakfast that are shown in this example. Okay, so hopefully you've all had time to read that. Now, most obviously in terms of language, there's two kind of named languages here you can see. So English, so if you look at line 1, it begins with I recommend, and then Japanese. Yeah, so in Japanese, that's udon salad noodles. Okay, so and what we can see here is the two languages. If we took a traditional approach, we'd say there's lots of code switching. So the participants move quickly between the two languages, even within the same construction and the same sentence. But I think it's also a little bit more complicated than this, because it's English used as a lingua franca. Yeah, so we've got English used in Tokyo between participants who are using it for intercultural communication, and the participants have different first languages. So it's not kind of Anglophone English, it's English as a lingua franca. The Japanese is also non-standard Japanese as well. But again, very common for kind of texting that the language used is non-standard. But then we also have examples where it's perhaps not so clear what language, what particular named language is being used. So one of the first examples is if you look on line 4, the name of the cafe where they're discussing having breakfast is Platform Cafe. Yeah, now is Platform Cafe English, or is it Japanese, or something else again? Yeah, that's the name of the cafe in Tokyo. Yeah, and it's called Platform Cafe in Japanese, but obviously platform is a word that we'd recognize in English, as is cafe, but of course cafe is also a French word as well. So if we look at that phrase, it's not at all clear which particular language it is. And also we have the use of various bits of text speak, which again don't neatly fit into any particular language category. So we have the on line 9, we have the LOL, laugh out loud, yeah, which is ubiquitous in many different languages. Now, of course, laugh out loud is originally English, but LOL, as used here, is not something that's just restricted to the English language. And then we have the emoticon that's used in texting, so the tide mark here, which is used for emphasis. Yeah, and you can see this occurs in various places in the text. And then we have the 3 dots at the end as well, which is used in a similar way to the tide mark. So actually, it's not necessarily clear in various places here which particular language is being used. And actually, I think that's not even necessarily the right question. Yeah, we don't need to know whether Platform Cafe is English, Japanese, or something else. And linguistic practices like this, where you've got this kind of mix of languages and where it's not necessarily easy to distinguish one language from the other, is what's often referred to as translanguaging, which I'm guessing probably quite a lot of you are already familiar with. And as we'll see, translanguaging fits in very well with the kind of transcultural approach that I'm going to be arguing for today. And then in terms of culture, we've got the topic of the conversation, which I said right at the beginning was kind of practices around breakfast food. And here you can see it begins with udon salad noodles. Yeah, which is obviously, I guess, certainly if you're British, would be quite an unusual breakfast food. But actually, even in this context, although udon noodles are perhaps traditionally associated with Japan, considered unusual for breakfast food here. And of course, it should also be pointed out that udon noodles are no longer just restricted to Japan. So they're pretty ubiquitous as a global food product. I'm guessing in most countries in the world, you can now get udon noodles. Then we also have the things to do with boiled egg and toast. Yep, so again, this is something that perhaps is associated more with kind of Anglophone breakfast, but again, it's something that both participants are very familiar with, and I think has become globally ubiquitous. Certainly in most major cities in the world, you could easily find a cafe that would serve you eggs and toast for breakfast. And then the last one you have is the orange. So again, orange juice for breakfast is kind of like globally ubiquitous or globally common, but it also has a Japanese tradition of a particular kind of satsuma orange, which is very common as a breakfast food. So what I would say, or what I would argue here, is that you have these kind of multiple scales simultaneously present in terms of the cultural practices. So how people go about eating breakfast, you have the local references to things like satsuma oranges for breakfast. Then you have the udon noodles, which are both local and global. And then you have the kind of globally ubiquitous egg and toast for breakfast. Yeah, and then you have the local references to very local places like platform, cafe, etc. So you have multiple scales or levels simultaneously present here. You have the kind of the local, you have the national, the regional, and the global all together at the same point. So you have these multiple scales and multiple languages used. Yeah, and I think this is a very common feature of a lot of intercultural and what I would call transcultural communication currently. And another reason I've picked this example is, despite all this complexity, I actually think this kind of communication is very common. It's nothing particularly unusual. And also, of course, the topic is very mundane. They're not talking about anything groundbreaking or anything particularly original or creative. They're just discussing what they're going to eat for breakfast, yeah, which you can't really get more ordinary or mundane than that. So I think transcultural communication is something that's extremely common, that we use all the time, but we don't really think about very much. And certainly I would argue within kind of applied linguistics and language teaching, we haven't really explored this in the kind of depth we need to, given how normal and how frequently it occurs. So I would argue in sum that the kind of example we see here shows that the diverse uses, users, settings and purposes of English as a global language problematizes a simplistic link between a named language, English, and a named culture, British or American. Yep, so if we think back to the questions we asked 10 minutes ago, that means that the English language, or any particular language, I will argue, is not necessarily linked to any particular name culture. And certainly in the example we've just looked at, it's hard to see how you could argue that the English language is somehow linked to American or British culture there. But at the same time, as many of you commented in your chat comments, this does not mean that language is culturally neutral. Yeah, I think we all agree that language is not culturally neutral. So we need to think of new ways about how language and culture might be linked. So I would argue that Global English's research challenges our thinking about the links between languages and cultures in intercultural communication, and in turn, how we might teach English and intercultural communication through that. Okay, so I just want to go through a bit of terminology just to kind of clarify and to make sure we all have a similar understanding of some of the key terms we're going to be using. So I will begin with Global Englishes, as I've said it a lot. Now, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with Global Englishes, but I think it's just helpful to go over it quickly. So I've picked as an image here the Education First EIP Index. So some of you may be familiar with this. I don't want to talk about it in detail. I think it's a very flawed index of English language proficiency. But what they do produce each year, which is quite nice, is a map of all the countries that they operate in. And in all of these countries, there is some proficiency in English. Now, you can see from the index, they argue that some places are lower proficiency than others, which I think is, as I said, the part that's more problematic. But what it does show is if you look around the world, English is spoken across pretty much every continent in the world. Yep, so Education First has a presence in every continent in the world, and there is some English language proficiency in every continent in the world. So English truly is a global language. The countries that are missing, of course, are the Anglophone countries here, because EF doesn't create an index of the proficiency of countries where English is the first language. Okay, so how can we define global Englishes? So global Englishes can be defined as an umbrella term for research covering the linguistic and social cultural dimensions of global uses and users of English. So this typically includes world Englishes, yep, so different nativized varieties of English around the world, such as Indian English or Singaporean English. English is an international language, and the area that I'm going to focus on particularly, English as a lingua franca. So as I said, the main focus of this presentation will be English as a lingua franca. So this can be defined from a functional perspective as any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative meaning of choice and often only option. Yep, so as I said, this is a functional definition. It looks at not what English is, but rather how it's used. Yep, so use of English among different first language speakers. So the definition here is important to point out also includes native speakers of English. So sometimes people have argued that English as a lingua franca doesn't include native speakers, but certainly most English as a lingua franca researchers would agree that it does include native speakers. Native speakers use English for intercultural communication, same as everybody else, and they use English in similar ways often to other ELF users. Yeah, and we saw that in the first example. So Hannah, who has English as a first language, it still appears in the example we saw very comfortable using English in a multilingual way. So most recently, Jennifer Jenkins has emphasized the multilingual dimension to English as a lingua franca. So she defines English as a lingua franca as multilingual communication in which English is available as a contact language of choice, and she has, but is not necessarily chosen. So we saw in the example there that English wasn't the only language present, and actually in some of the data that ELF researchers look at now, there's maybe very little English, but English often influences the interaction in one way or another, just as when English is used, other languages present typically influence the interaction there as well. So as I said, the definitions of English as a lingua franca include native speakers, but importantly, native speakers are not the linguistic reference norm. So when we look at English as a lingua franca, native varieties of English are, in terms of norms, considered irrelevant. It's also important to emphasize, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but I think it always needs repeating because it is often misunderstood. ELF is, or English as a lingua franca, is not a variety of English. So unlike world Englishes like Indian or Singaporean or Nigerian English, English as a lingua franca is not a variety. So rather, it's a variable way of using English. So it's a function of English. Now, the crucial question is how that English that functions as a lingua franca is conceptualized. Yeah, and that's something that I think ELF researchers are still working on. But it's important to be clear that when I'm talking about English as a lingua franca, I'm not talking about any particular variety of English. I'm talking about a highly variable, multilingual and transcultural use of English. Okay, so the next term that I think needs defining is intercultural communication. So intercultural communication, it can be defined as communication where cultural and linguistic differences are perceived as relevant to the interaction by participants or researchers. Yep, so it's any communication where there's some kind of cultural and linguistic difference. It's important to stress that it's not the comparison of distinct bounded national cultures. Yeah, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So I'm going to adopt what's often referred to as a critical approach to intercultural communication. And I think the questions asked here by the scholars 20 years or so ago are very crucial for how we think about critical intercultural communication. So they argue that as a researcher of intercultural communication, we need to set aside a priori notions of group membership and identity and ask instead how and under what circumstances concepts such as culture are produced by participants as relevant categories. Yeah, and they propose these three questions. So who has introduced culture as a relevant category, for what purposes and with what consequences? Yeah, and I think those three questions are crucial for intercultural communication researchers. We're interested in culture, but we need to take a critical approach to it and look at who's introduced it, for what purposes and with what consequences. So as I said, this distinguishes intercultural communication from cross-cultural communication. So cross-cultural communication is perhaps the more traditional approach to studying cultural difference. It's one that certainly within research has kind of fallen out of fashion in the last 20 years or so, but I think is still a big part of English language teaching and a lot of language teaching in fact. So cross-cultural communication is typically the study of communicative practices of distinct cultural groups independent from interaction. Yep, so you compare the communicative practices of one group to the communicative practices of another group. Now that's very different to intercultural communication research. Intercultural communication research looks at the communicative practices of distinct cultural groups in interaction with each other, and that's the crucial part. It's when people actually interact that people in intercultural communication research are interested in. So it's not comparing Chinese communicative practices and Thai communicative practices. It's looking at when someone who's got Thai as their first language and when someone who has Mandarin Chinese as their first language, when they interact, what happens in that interaction. And this often uses, a different kind of approach to the research and analysis. So in cross-cultural communication, cultures are typically seen as discrete and separable, whereas in intercultural communication, cultures are seen as not having fixed boundaries, but rather with blurred boundaries. And cultures are often viewed as things that can be adapted and hybridized. In cross-cultural communication, cultures are typically viewed as homogenous, so people are within a cultural grouping are seen as the same. And typically they are seen as the same at the national level. Whereas in intercultural communication, cultures are seen as heterogeneous with lots of variety among members of the cultures, and a national scale is just one of many different scales or discourse communities. In cross-cultural communication, there's a priori assumptions about cultural groupings and where participants are located within cultures. In intercultural communication, as I said before when quoting from the scholars, there are no a priori assumptions. So rather, participants are, so how culture is used is investigated in the interaction itself, and participants are often seen as located between cultures. So they're drawing on kind of hybridized or adapted versions of two or more different cultures. Okay, so now I want to get into a little bit of theory. So I think this brings up interesting questions about how we see the connections between language and culture. So under traditional approaches, language and cultures are seen as strongly linked. So probably the most well-known example of this is linguistic relativity, or what's often referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So they write that our world and our culture are built up by the language that we speak. The real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. Yep, so I think this was a really important part of how people kind of, certainly within linguistics, thought about the relationship between language and culture. So the idea that language is how we categorize our world, how we see our world, and how it influences our worldview. Now, what exactly Sapir and Whorf argued for is actually a matter of some debate. So there are different interpretations of linguistic relativity, and I won't get into that here, but I'm happy to talk about it in more detail later if people are interested. But if you take the strong, or what's often called the linguistic deterministic perspective, you end up with a perspective, the second perspective that I've got here. So here, this researcher, Gu, writes that the English language carries with it values and beliefs which are hidden in linguistic codes, but control from the depths the processes of meaning making during human interaction. Yep, so this is the strongest interpretation of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So the idea that a language and a culture are synonymous. So the English language has within it the English culture in one way or another. So when you use the English language, whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, you're recreating the categories and culture of the Anglophone world. Now, I think that's really problematic. That simply does not fit global uses of English and does not fit the kind of research and the kind of data that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years from particularly English as a lingua franca and also intercultural communication research. Yeah, so I think we really need to revisit this and certainly avoid the kind of the strongest and most simplistic correlations between language and culture as suggested here. So instead, I think we need to deconstruct the language and cultural relationship, particularly through intercultural communication and global initiatives. And here I'm going to be drawing on Karen Riesinger's what she terms the language, culture, nexus. Now, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. If you are, I should say that I'm not following her exact approach. It's informed how I think about it, but I've interpreted her theory a little bit differently to how she's interpreted it. But I've certainly drawn very strongly on her thinking here. So she distinguishes, and importantly, she distinguishes between different levels of language and culture. So she begins with the idea that culture and language are inexorably linked at both the individual lingua culture level. So this means that for us as individuals, languages and cultures are always interlinked. So we learn languages in a particular cultural context, and that's what gives language its meaning. So for each individual, every kind of aspect of language that you use has a particular meaning for you, and that meaning is derived from the cultural context in which you learned it. So at this level, languages and cultures are indeed linked. Furthermore, in the most general sense, language and culture are also linked in that language is a cultural practice. Yep, so again, this is perhaps, well, not really controversial, but it can be debated. So if we see language as a cultural practice, then the general concept of language is always linked to culture because it's part of cultural practices. Now, of course, if you were a Chomskyan linguist, you wouldn't agree with that. You say language is innate and something cognitive rather than cultural. But certainly, I think most social linguists and many applied linguists would now see language as a cultural practice. However, and this is the crucial part, culture and language are not inexorably linked at the level of particular named languages and cultures. So in other words, the English language and English culture are not necessarily linked. So therefore, languages are not tied to national conceptions of cultural and linguistic communities, which are ideological entities. So I think you can perhaps explain that a bit easier through diagrams. For those of you who like diagrams, I always like visual representations of things. So I tend to make diagrams of things to help me understand them. So if we look at culture and language at 3 different levels, we can see how they're both connected and not connected. So at the most general level, the concept of language is a cultural practice. Yep, so at this kind of general level, when we're not talking about any specific language, but we're just talking about the idea of language and the idea of culture, then they're linked. However, at the level of particular named languages, so the English language and English culture, they're not necessarily linked. Yep, so in other words, we can use the English language to construct and represent other cultures as well, as we can for any language. Yep, we could use Thai to talk about English culture, or we could use English to talk about Thai culture. So at the level of named languages and named cultures, they're not necessarily linked. They can, of course, be linked, but they don't have to be. And then we come back to the individual level. Yeah, and again, here they're linked. So for every time you use language, it has a meaning, and that meaning is learned in cultural context. But these are individual. We each use our language or our linguistic resources in different ways. We each have different sets of kind of communities and histories that give rise to each individual having a different kind of perspective on culture. So this is highly individual. Yeah, this is something that only each person has, this particular link. So hopefully you can see now that at various levels, language and culture are linked, but they are the one level that they're not linked at is the level, the national scale of nations and language. Yeah, and Karen Reisinger argues quite correctly, I think, that there's been confusion, particularly within language teaching, between mixing up these different levels. So there's an assumption because language and culture are linked at these 2 levels, that they must also be linked at this level. But this simply is not supported by empirical evidence. So in sum, we can say that culture and language are always linked in the most general sense and in the individual, in that there's always a link between language and culture, but which particular languages and cultures are linked together is not fixed. So the link between languages and cultures is always an empirical question and can only be investigated by looking at each instance of communication. Hence, there's no fixed relationship that can be established. Yeah, and again, we'll look at some more examples of that as we go throughout the rest of this seminar, yeah, which will hopefully illustrate these points. Okay, so the last kind of bit of theory that I wanted to look at was cultural identity and intercultural communication, because again, I think global Englishes and English as a lingua franca research brings up some interesting findings here. So why should we be interested in identity? Well, researchers have emphasized the central role that language plays in constructing identity. So language is very much a kind of part of our identity. And when we use language, we are often in one way or another constructing and negotiating identities, whether we're doing that consciously or unconsciously. And culture is, again, very closely tied to identity. So if we're interested in culture and language, then we are necessarily going to be interested in identity as well. So cultural identity research typically looks at how in intercultural communication, categories such as nation, ethnicity, and race contribute to the construction of cultural identity and the ways that these are often either accepted, negotiated, resisted, or ascribed in intercultural interactions. And especially relevant to what we're talking about today, there have been studies that explore the new spaces that globalization opens up to the construction of cultural identities, yeah, which are often not tied to any particular national community. Global English's research in particular underscores a move away from essentialist conflations of cultural identity with national cultures and languages. So I would argue that it's been at the forefront of decentering the Anglophone native speaker of the model for intercultural communication through English. Yeah, simply because much of the data, as we'll see, doesn't involve native speakers of English and certainly has very little or no reference to Anglophone cultures in any way. So, for example, participants in global English's research have been reported and observed using English to create and index multiple different kinds of identities. So some of the earlier research looked at the way that people used English to move between local L1 identities and more global orientations. It was also noted that people often constructed shared multilingual and multicultural identities in ELF interaction. Yep, so participants related to each other through their being everybody feeling that they were multilingual and multicultural. We've also looked at, over the last 10 years or so, identification with dynamic communities of practice and virtual communities as well. Yeah, so these are the kind of communities that are much more fluid and transient than more established communities. Also, the idea of third place identities and participants being in between and mediating between different cultural and other groupings. Yeah, and this is something I looked at a lot in my kind of earlier research. And then there's also the freer, liminal, and more fluid identities that are not indexed to or between any particular cultures or identifications. Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. However, it's also important to emphasize that people aren't free to construct any particular identity they want. Yeah, as I said right at the beginning, identities are negotiated, but they can also be ascribed to people, and there's also limits on people's negotiation. And certainly when it comes to English, there's still power issues and the pull of native English speakers and Anglophone ideologies. Yeah, and certainly within English language teaching, there's a very strong influence of Anglophone ideology still. So I thought I'd show you some examples of what I mean by this. So the idea of kind of hybrid adaptable identities. Oh, okay. Back again. Right. So certainly, so as I was saying, yes. So the idea of adaptable and hybrid identities. Yep. So I think this example I've chosen here from some of my earlier research, I think illustrates this quite nicely. So this was a participant from my PhD project. This was a student at a university in Thailand who spoke English a lot of English-speaking friends. Yeah, and this is what the way she kind of talked about when she used English, and the kind of she had a very multicultural and multilingual group of friends. And she says about using English, yeah, it's not like a passion. I want to be like American people. I want to be like British people. It's not like that. So she's very clearly there rejecting the idea that in using English, she's identifying with becoming an Anglophone speaker. I won't read all of it. I'll just go to the next highlighted bit. She says, it's not just the Thai way, but also the other way that you think is good from that. Even if you speak with other people who is non-English speaker, yeah, people tend to forget their own culture for a while and they become more open. So she has this very clearly, I think, articulates this idea of being in, recording sorts itself out now. So I think here she very clearly has this idea of being in between cultures. Yeah, so she's not following the American way, but also she's not necessarily following the Thai way. She's more open. Yeah, so the way she phrases it is people forget their own culture for a while. Yeah, and she explicitly says they become more open. And I think that's a very clear expression of what kind of hybrid or third place identity is. Not part of one or another culture, but drawing on different aspects of it and feeling that you're in a kind of a liminal or freer place in between them. Okay, so the next example I wanted to look at was how identity is actually constructed and negotiated within interaction. So as you saw in the previous example, this was somebody's interpretation and kind of explanation of how they felt their identity was expressed through English. But I think what's interesting about the next example we're going to look at is you can actually see the way that identity is negotiated within the interaction itself. So in this example, this is called Are You Chinese? And you'll see why. So this came from an online text-based chat room of a course in intercultural communication that I ran with a university in Thailand. And in this chat room, there were a group of students. There was a Chinese student, 2 Thai students, a Canadian student, and a Brazilian student. And they were all discussing kind of where they grew up and their background. So they were kind of introducing themselves to each other. So you can see here in the first line, we have Sarah, who's Canadian, very clearly expressing a kind of third place identity here. So she says, I originally come from Canada, but I grew up in Germany, so I consider myself to be in between a native and a non-native speaker. Yeah, which of course is interesting in itself. But actually the thing I find most interesting is the underlying sections of the text here, where you see the negotiation of cultural identity taking place. So Wasana here, one of the Thai participants, asked the Chinese participant Ying, "Are you Chinese, Ying?" And Ying says yes. And then that leads Som and Wasana to both say "Ni hao ma," "Ni hao," and Ying to reply "Ni hao." And then this leads to Wasana gives a bit more information. She tells Ying, "My ancestors are Chinese." At which point Ying ascribes a Chinese identity to Wasana. So she says, "Oh, nice to meet you. Perhaps that's why you are not talkative, for Chinese are sometimes over modest." So you can see here in these two lines, line 20 and 21, Ying is ascribing Wasana a Chinese identity. Yeah, the idea of being modest and quiet as being kind of part of a Chinese cultural identity. And what's particularly interesting is that Wasana doesn't accept this. So I don't consider that because I don't talk Chinese when I was a child. I have just taken some Chinese courses and I don't speak it in my daily life. And then Sarah asks Wasana, "Did you spend some time in China as well?" And Wasana says, "I've never been to China too." So here Wasana is rejecting Ying's ascription of a Chinese identity. So for Wasana to feel Chinese, she would have to grow up speaking Chinese, she'd have to use it in her daily life, and she'd have to have spent some time in China. So you can see here how what counts as a Chinese cultural identity is not fixed, it's negotiable. So what for Ying constitutes a Chinese cultural identity is different for Wasana, and they're actually debating this in the interaction itself. So overall, I think the kind of research we see in intercultural communication and global Englishes questions many of our kind of assumptions about language and culture. So the fluid and emergent links between languages and cultures and identities in intercultural communication challenges our understanding of the connections between these categories. This superdiversity and complexity of languages and cultures highlights the difficulties and I think the inappropriateness of attempting to establish set language culture connections. So in the first example we looked at of "It's not breakfast food," whose cultural practices were the participants discussing and where were they located, if anywhere? Yeah, so we had multiple scales present. Yeah, we had multiple different kind of cultural practices around eating breakfast. In the example that we've just looked at, "Are you Chinese?" what counts as a cultural identity? Yep, so what makes you Chinese or Thai or something like that or something else? And how much of this can be negotiated? Yeah, and we saw in that example, there was quite a lot of scope there for negotiation, but that's not always the case. So I would argue that these examples show that the intercultural communication becomes problematic, as it's frequently not clear what cultures participants are in between. Yeah, and particularly if you look back to the first example, "It's not breakfast food." As I said, there were multiple scales simultaneously present there, and it wasn't at all clear. They certainly weren't in between American and Japanese culture. I think that would be a very simplistic reading of what was happening. So I think the intercultural communication becomes difficult to maintain. So this leads me on to the next part and the kind of the last part of the theory, from intercultural to transcultural communication. Yep, so I would argue that the limitations of intercultural communication, as highlighted by Global English's research, means that we need to, well, not reject intercultural communication research, that's certainly not what I'm arguing, but we need to add another aspect to that, which is transcultural communication. So if you look up trans in the dictionary, often dictionary definitions don't fit academic definitions very well, but actually in this case, they fit it very nicely. So I've put this up here. So trans is defined as a cross beyond, crossing on the other side, changing thoroughly and transcending. Yeah, and it comes from Latin trans, which means across, through and beyond. Yeah, and I think all of those concepts, the idea of moving through, beyond, across and transcending and changing, are all crucial aspects of transcultural communication. So as lots of you are probably familiar with, many disciplines within applied linguistics, sociology, etc., are going through a bit of what's been termed a trans turn at the moment. So as Hawkins and Mori argue in relation to applied linguistics, this move towards a trans disposition signals the need to transcend the named and bounded categories that have historically shaped our thinking about the world and its inhabitants, the nature of knowledge and communicative resources. Lonsman et al. In a special issue of the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology on transience argue that our objects of study are not treated as given, but as in a state of flux, emergent, in a state of being negotiated and shaped, of being stabilized or not, or of losing traction and giving way to subsequent constitutions of social orderliness. And lastly, Alistair Pennycutt writes that from a trans perspective, I trait transgressive to refer to the need to have both political and epistemological tools to transgress the boundaries of conventional thought and politics. So I think what all these kind of these quotations show are that trans theories move beyond this idea of any kind of fixed category. So all categories are seen as constantly in change and constantly in movement, and we're looking at things that emerge but then disappear again, things that are constantly changing, things that move across and over boundaries and borders. Yeah, and they can be transgressive in one way or another. Yeah, and hopefully over the next kind of 10 or 15 minutes, I'll explain in more detail what these mean in practice. So transcultural communication itself. Transcultural communication can be defined as communication where interactants are seen moving through and across rather than in between cultural and linguistic boundaries. In which the, okay, say that again then. So it's communication in which interactants are seen moving through and across rather than in between cultural and linguistic boundaries, in which those very borders become blurred and transcended. Furthermore, such boundary crossing and blurring, whether as an unconscious part of everyday communicative practices or as a deliberately transgressive act, highlights the transformative nature of such interactions whereby named languages and cultures can no longer be taken for granted. So if you remember the cross-cultural and intercultural table that we looked at earlier on in this presentation, we can now add transcultural to that. So I won't go over the cross-cultural and intercultural again, but I'll go through what transcultural communication means in more detail. So in transcultural communication, it's the studies of communicative practices where cultural and linguistic differences are relevant to the participants or researchers, so follows on from the definition of intercultural communication. However, they're not necessarily linked to any particular group. Yep, so they're not necessarily linked to any national culture. Culture and linguistic boundaries in transcultural communication can be transcended and transgressed. And cultures are seen as heterogeneous as they are in intercultural communication research. And cultural characterizations are contestable. Yep, so what counts as a particular cultural characterization is not fixed. Yep, it can be debated and contested. Now, national cultures are still important, just as they were in intercultural and cross-cultural communication research. Yeah, people draw on national identities a lot. However, they're seen as one of many scales ranging from the local to the global. And participants move through and across rather than in between. And that's crucial, this idea that participants don't have to be in between cultures. So cultural practices and representations can be constructed in situ and emergent, and participants are not necessarily in between any named cultures. Yep, so as we'll see in some of the other examples, participants can draw on multiple cultural scales or cultural groupings simultaneously without necessarily being between any of them. Yeah, and that's a crucial distinction between intercultural and transcultural communication. So again, I think it will be helpful to put an example here, and this is one that I think Dr. Chitmal will be very familiar with. It comes from her data. So this was taken from a study of international students in the UK and the exchanges they had on the social networking site Facebook. And this came from a private message exchange on Facebook between two international students, North, whose first language was Thai, and Ling, whose first language was Chinese. Okay, so I'd like you just to quickly read through that. It's a very short extract, so it shouldn't take you very long. So just have a look at that. Here you can see what they're discussing is the upcoming autumn festival, and in particular Mooncake. So I'll give you a minute or two to read through that example. Okay, so hopefully you've all had time to read it. Often when I show this example, I need to explain what the Mid-Autumn Festival and Mooncake is, but I'm guessing most people here are very familiar with it. So I won't explain that. But in terms of if we start with the cultural practices here, I think in terms of the cultural practices, we clearly have the idea of the Mid-Autumn Festival and the exchange of mooncake during the Mid-Autumn Festival. Now, this again, I think, can be seen at multiple different cultural scales. So we have its kind of origins in China and the Mid-Autumn Festival as associated with Chinese culture, but it's also a pan-Asian festival now. So it's something that obviously you celebrate in Thailand and many other Asian countries. And many other Asian countries celebrate it as well. So it's also has a regional reach. But also, I think you can see here, I mean, these two are international students in the UK. So it also has a global reach as well. So the Mid-Autumn Festival is something that's celebrated by diasporas of Chinese, but also other Asian people around the world. And many non-Asian people now, such as myself, would be very familiar with this festival too. So you can see it has multiple scales there in terms of the festival itself, and also how it's practiced here. So here you have it practiced in a local setting. So this is at a UK university, and there are references to the local places, so or local context. So I'll give you back on Saturday. Yep, so a reference to their local kind of setting. And also it's important to note that this whole exchange takes place in the virtual setting of Facebook. So you have all these different scales simultaneously present here. You have the cultural practices associated with the Mid-Autumn Festival, which relate to China, but also Asia, but also globally. Then you have the local contextualization with international students based in the UK. And then you have the virtual scale of this taking place in the social networking site Facebook. And the way that language links here, I think, is particularly interesting. So on the surface, this looks like it's in English, but as I'm speaking to a Thai audience, I'm guessing you've already spotted that it's not all English and it's not that simple. So the first line, my lovely daughter, would certainly not be a phrase that would be part of standard English. So again, I'm guessing lots of you worked out that this is kind of a translation of the Thai phrase, so referring to a younger close friend as your daughter. Yep, so North here is quite a bit older than Ling. So she translates the kind of Thai phrase of referring to a younger friend as a daughter and just translates it into English. And then on line 4, 5, you have what I find particularly interesting here, the use of P. Yep, so P-sa, P-yui, and P-bo. So again, it's to do with naming practices. And here you've got the Thai naming practices of referring to an older friend as P, as in older sibling. But this has not been translated into English, so she hasn't written older brother or older sister, Sa, Yui, and Bo. She's just written P, and she's even kept the orthography, the Thai tonal mark for P. So I think with that one, it's very hard to distinguish which particular language that is. It is Thai, of course, but it's not written as Thai, and it's in an English sentence. So again, the link between language and culture here is quite complex. And then really interesting on line 7, this is also taken up by Ling. So Ling says, can you tell Pisa? Now Ling isn't familiar with Thai culture and doesn't speak Thai, but she has taken up Norse naming practices here. So you have through the language here, you can see the different naming practices that come from Thai originally, but in different ways are embedded within the kind of the English text here. And of course, this English is being used by someone whose first language is Thai and someone else's first language is Chinese. So again, the links between language and culture here are not easily associated with any one particular culture or one particular language. And of course, yet again, you have these emoticons, the title mark here to give emphasis to what's said here. So altogether here, I think you can see the kind of complexity of languages and cultures used and the links between them. So you've got multiple scales of cultural reference from the very local to the global, and then you have languages used in the kind of very fluid way documented in translanguaging, particularly on things like the phrase in line 1, lines 4, 5, and 7 with the P and the naming practices, yet which don't neatly fit into one particular language. So in summary, we can see that the use of English as a multilingua franca for intercultural and transcultural communication across the globe in diverse cultural contexts questions simplistic and stereotyped associations between a particular language and culture. So in particular, the English language somehow associated with Anglophone cultures. Yeah, it's very hard to see in what way the previous example of Mooncake was in any way associated with Anglophone cultures. So I would argue that the link between languages and cultures are formed in each interaction, and how they're linked will always be an empirical question. We need to look at each interaction to decide in what ways they are linked. So in English as a lingua franca communication in particular, we see English and importantly other languages used to construct cultural references, practices and identities in a fluid manner which can transcend fixed linguistic and cultural borders. So we still have the kind of hybridized third place culture as an intercultural communication, but also at the same time, as we saw in the Mooncake example of the It's Not Breakfast Food, we have multiple cultural references and scales simultaneously present at the same time. And this leads to emergent cultural practices and identities that are not related to any specific culture, but transcend, transgress and transform cultural and linguistic boundaries. Okay, so that's it for the kind of the theory. I don't know if we want to stop to see if there are any questions or any comments people want to make before I go on to the next part of the presentation, or whether we should just go on to the next part of the presentation. What do you think, Yusuf?
Maybe you can ask for some, if any participants, if they have any questions to ask you here before you move to the next slide, okay. I guess.
Yeah, so that's kind of, that's it for the theory bit. So we'll go on to teaching in a minute, but if people have questions about the theory or questions about the ideas, then please feel free to ask now.
May I try one question? As today, we often communicate in a virtual world, like chit chat via Facebook or some other platforms. And most of students and also my friends, so far as I have observed, they tend to sort of present themselves like a global citizen, I would use this word. And you mentioned about the hybrid identity, and you asked, you proposed the concept of hybrid identity. So is it the same thing that if we define ourselves as a global citizen, or we have global citizenship, it means that we have hybrid identity? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So I think global citizenship is often defined in different ways. So I think it would depend how you define it. So I've certainly used the term a lot in my research. In my research, though, it typically refers to kind of an educational concept or an educational aim. So the idea of learning a language or learning about other cultures, it doesn't just have to be through language learning, to connect with kind of communities across the globe and to have a kind of social responsibility that's at a global scale rather than just a local scale. So in that sense, I'd say that would be different to hybrid identities. But also, I think for actually many people who, as you were just describing, would describe themselves as global citizens, yes, the idea of a hybrid identity which mixes different elements of different cultures would certainly be part of that. And certainly in the research we've done where we've talked to students about whether they feel they're a global citizen or not, then they would certainly bring up aspects like hybridized identities or adaptable identities that draw on different aspects of the different cultures they're familiar with. So yes, I think there is certainly a link between the two.
Thank you.
I think Andrew raised his hand. He's raising his hand. So
Okay.
Andrew, would you like to ask the question, please?
A quick question for the transcultural communication movement, which I like. I like how you put it together. What does that do to something like intercultural communicative competence or intercultural competence? Thanks.
Okay, yes, that's an excellent question. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I won't. So yes, I mean, what I think it does is in terms of intercultural competence, and certainly things like intercultural communicative competence, which is a well-explored concept in language teaching, I think it means that we need to move beyond the kind of focus exclusively on the national scale. And I think as educators, often that doesn't represent a lot of our students' experiences. Now, I'm not saying that we should ignore the national. As I said, it's probably one of the most, or if not the most kind of frequent identity that people draw on, and often the way that people explain their own behavior. But it is also one of many. And I think as the examples have shown here, often the way that our students communicate and the research that we look at intercultural communication shows that nation is often not present in any form whatsoever, or when it is present, it's one of many different scales that people draw on. So in terms of intercultural competence, it means looking at culture as a process, as something that's constantly in movement, that's not fixed. So it would mean things like transcending stereotypes, transcending generalizations, being highly adaptable and flexible, having a kind of awareness of things like translanguaging, transcultural communication, multilingualism, multiculturality, things like that. I mean, it's a big area, and I certainly can't answer all of that question quickly. But the main thing I would emphasize is this idea of flexibility and moving beyond fixed categories. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question. I do actually have a book coming out on this. Sorry to promote something, but it answers that question exactly on the subject of language education and intercultural and transcultural awareness, which should hopefully be coming out with Cambridge in the next month or so.
Okay. I think we are going to have another question from Filmo Morino. Sorry if I pronounce your name wrong.
That's fine. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a quick question. So considering that English is being used in ELF to construct cultural references, so I wonder, how do we maintain the authenticity of the culture? And is it inevitable that the culture being framed now by English has this tendency to be diluted? I hope this makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, I think authenticity is an interesting question. And I think there are quite rightly worries that I think maybe not so much at the national scale, but certainly I know within multilingual education, or multilingual scholarship, there are quite rightly worries about the fact that English, and not just English, other languages, particularly other large global languages, erode kind of other cultural identities. And I think that is, people are quite right to worry about that. So, but I think transcultural communication should hopefully, in a way, help with that, because it moves away from the idea of any one particular language being dominant. So as we see with English here, English exists alongside other languages. And certainly people like Jennifer Jenkins have emphasized the multilingual aspects of English as a lingua franca communication is coming first. So multilingualism comes before English. So I think that's probably the way forward with it, is that to recognize that English, whether we like it or not, and we can all debate as to whether it's good or bad that English is a global language, but the reality is that it is a global language, whether we like it or not. But then how do we, as educators and researchers, deal with that? Well, first of all, we need to report what we see, which is that English is prevalent in many different locations, and but what we can emphasize that is used in very diverse ways. So we need to kind of pull away this part of the Anglophone associations from it. Now, in terms of authenticity, that means, yeah, I mean, that can mean different things. If you think authentic English is Anglophone English, then yes, you won't agree with global Englishes and English as a lingua franca research. But if you think of authenticity as being something that people create in their own local context, then hopefully English can be used in new and creative ways to create new forms of authenticity. But yes, it is certainly a concern that it may kind of, certainly within multilingualism, there is a concern that it's not going to help with minority languages or languages that have smaller numbers of speakers. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If you have any other question, please feel free to ask, or Dr. will move on. Okay, we got some raised hand from Nathan. Nathan Swin.
I think
Nathan's you need to unmute your microphone, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a questions. If we see language and cultures being more dynamic, do you think that in the future, perhaps, English as a foreign language status would be a little less important, meaning do the English speaker or us or whoever use English with the English as an EFL concept in mind would be more tolerant to English being a little more different from the target, as you know, as we are aiming English as, I don't know, I think you understand my questions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's exactly the point, that English is a lingua franca and global English's research is the idea that it moves away from there being one kind of English and recognizes that, first of all, there are multiple varieties of English, as in world English is, but also there's lots of English is highly variable in its use. So it's not just any particular variety, it's a variable use of English, and that English is embedded within wider multilingual or translingual practices. So it's certainly, yes, I mean, it should, the whole point is to document that the way people use English is not related to any one particular norm or standard, and that hopefully that will influence both research and teaching and move away from this kind of, there is a one particular correct standard. So yes, I mean, certainly my ideological motivation and kind of impetus for lots of this research is to increase tolerance for variety of English and to increase tolerance for multilingualism.
Thank you.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next part? And there'll be plenty of time at the end to ask further questions if people have further questions. Okay, yeah, I can see Chitmal's nodding ahead, so I'll move on. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about today was the implications for English language teaching. So this is, I should say, this is very much kind of still a work in progress. As I said, I've just kind of written or finished writing a short book on this, but that is kind of being put out there as ideas to be discussed further. So as I said, this is very much kind of new and still work in progress. So I'd very much appreciate your thoughts on this. So transcultural language education, as I'm referring to it. So I see this as a next step in the kind of, so it's not anything revolutionary or new, it's a continuation of what's been an ongoing process over the last 20 or 30 years, certainly in Europe anyway, of widening language education beyond its kind of traditional focus on linguistic forms, monolingualism and national cultures. So it's learning and using an additional language being seen as an intercultural and transcultural process. Yeah, and this is certainly within theory and often within policy is widely recognized now. So if you look at many language policies around the world, including the Thai language policies, yeah, they often have references to intercultural communication, learning about cultural others, learning about your own culture. So I think there is a general acknowledgement that language learning is a cultural process in one way or another. I don't think that's particularly controversial, and the fact that it's now in many government policies would suggest it's not at all controversial. But I do think it hasn't really filtered down into pedagogy, so into actual teaching practices as much as it could. And I think probably most problematic is that there are still essentialist national language and culture correlations, and they're still prominent in language teaching and particularly in English language teaching. And I would argue that often these kind of simplistic or stereotype cultural categorizations are more likely to hinder rather than help intercultural and transcultural communication. So I propose a transcultural language education approach which recognizes the multilingual, multimodal and multicultural resources and the translanguaging, transmodal and transcultural processes that L2 learning and use entails. So what does this mean? So I think we can make this is itself a bit of a stereotype and a simplified distinction, but we can perhaps make a distinction between traditional ELT and transcultural ELT. So in traditional ELT, cultures are typically approached at national scales. We have standard language ideologies with a national language variety associated with national cultural characterizations. Yeah, and certainly if we look at language learning materials, this is very common. In contrast, in transcultural ELT, we take a critical approach to language, culture, and identity that challenges established discourses and recognizes the global role of English as a multi-lingua franca for transcultural communication across and through borders. In traditional language teaching, we get communicative competence, which focuses on linguistic and grammatical competence. But in transcultural ELT, we have intercultural communicative competence and intercultural or transcultural awareness. So competence is expanded beyond linguistic categories and it includes pragmatic competence and fostering positive attitudes to differences and others. So the model in traditional ELT is traditionally the native speaker. Yep. So in English, the Anglophone native speaker, whether that be American or English or Australian or something else. In transcultural ELT, this is replaced with an intercultural speaker and intercultural citizen as the model, or as the question came up earlier, the global citizen as the model. Yep, so students are no longer aiming to speak like a native speaker, rather they're aiming to become an intercultural speaker and a global citizen. So in traditional ELT, there's a focus on linguistic products. So this would include grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, etc. And it's typically focused on fixed form, so a product. Whereas in transcultural ELT, there's a move towards a focus on the processes of communication. So as I said in answer to the earlier question, the idea of flexibility and adaptation and emergent resources is crucial. So this means that you focus on processes and adaptable use of communicative resources. And this would include things such as English as a multilingua franca awareness. So students being aware of, if they're learning English, that it's likely to be used in multilingual scenarios. And lastly, in traditional ELT, you have endonormative Anglophone methodologies and approaches, whereas in transcultural ELT, you have teaching based on local contexts and cultures. So what does this mean for actual kind of teaching practices? So transcultural pedagogy goes, I would argue, beyond awareness raising, although this is still a crucial step. So lots of previous intercultural communicative competence work, including my own, focused typically on raising students' awareness of multilingualism and interculturality. And I think that's still crucial and really important. But I think it's also important that it includes change and action on the part of the learners. So this means engagement with diverse communities across cultural and linguistic boundaries. And how can we go about this? Well, as I said, there isn't one methodology that would be most suitable for this, but I think there are various things that teachers can bring into their teaching. So activities can include things such as critically exploring cultural and linguistic images and discourses, in materials, media, and local communities. Yep, so we're all surrounded by culture in one way or another, and the language classroom, I think, is an excellent place to explore that. So this can be discourses of culture and images of culture in the language teaching materials themselves, whether that be textbooks, exam syllabuses, whatever. It can also be in local media. Yep, so local TV, local websites, local, whatever sources. And of course in the local community. So typically exploring local communities, you realize that actually there's a lot of multilingualism and multiculturalism in even the most apparently monolingual communities. It's very rare that a community has no other languages spoken or has nobody from outside that community in one way or another, or it doesn't have people that are members of multiple different communities at the same time. So in this way, students can get an understanding of the complexity and culture and language in their own setting, which then they can hopefully generalize to other settings as well. Yeah, which leads on to the second point, which is exploring the complexity of our own culture and language. Yep, so looking at how our own language is used in different settings, how our own cultures can be debated in different ways, can be characterized differently by different people, and how they've changed over time. Yeah, and again, hopefully from that you can generalize to understanding other cultures and languages as being equally complex and changeable. And then, of course, as I said, action is a crucial part of this. So it's not just kind of reflection and exploration, but also engaging in interactions with cultural others. Yeah, now, if people are fortunate enough to be in an environment that's already very multilingual and multicultural, then of course it should be easy enough to do this in person. If they're fortunate enough to be in a well-resourced setting where they can travel abroad on educational exchanges and things like that, then of course these are excellent ways to engage in intercultural interactions. But of course that's not always possible, and it can be very expensive to do educational exchanges. But we can now do it, of course, virtually. So over the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge amount of research in things such as telecollaboration and teletandem learning, where classes in different countries are linked up with each other virtually in one way or another, whether that's simply through email or through much more kind of recent things, through social media or through video links and things like that. Yep, so I would argue that there are lots of ways that we can actively engage in intercultural interactions with cultural others in one way or another in the classroom. And then it's important, well, in fact, it's not just important, it's crucial that there is space in classes to reflect on intercultural and transcultural experiences, to discuss them, to discuss what it means for language learning and for language use. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that the classroom can really help with, that most people will have intercultural experiences and transcultural experiences, but often they have very little opportunity to discuss them as such. And I think the language classroom is the ideal place to discuss such things. But I do think the details of how you might go about this are best decided by local teachers. Yeah, I wouldn't like to tell people that they need to do things in a particular way. So what does it mean for teaching and for teachers? So as I said, there's no single methodology here, rather it's just a range of different approaches and drawing on different perspectives. Yeah, and which perspectives you draw on and how exactly you do that, I think is best decided by local teachers and in local settings. So it needs to be recognised that the labels that I used earlier on, such as traditional and transcultural language teaching, are broad categories and simplifications to some degree. So it's perfectly possible for teachers to adopt different elements from both approaches, depending on the circumstances and preferences. Yep, so there may be times when they need to adopt a more traditional approach, perhaps to prepare for an exam or something like that. But there are other times when a more transcultural approach can be introduced into the classroom. And also teachers can make incremental changes towards a more transcultural approach. So I'm not arguing that people need to follow all of these perspectives or all of these approaches all at the same time. Yeah, different elements can be adopted and teachers can perhaps move more towards it in different circumstances when teaching allows. So I think, as with all research, there's a two-way relationship between research and teaching. So I don't think researchers go away and do their research and then give that to teachers and teachers just implement it. I think it's very much a two-way process. So hopefully research can inform and inspire teachers, but the details of how to incorporate aspects of a transcultural approach are best decided in local settings based on the needs and interests of teachers and students. So as I said right at the beginning, this is still very much a work in progress and something that I've only really been thinking about for the last few years. Yeah, but I think lots of the ideas, as I said, are not necessarily revolutionary ideas. They're building on things that are already out there. So many of the core features of a transcultural approach to ELT are already being investigated. So intercultural and transcultural awareness are not particularly new ideas. Yeah, I've certainly been working on the concept of intercultural awareness for the last 10 years or more. And before that, intercultural communicative competence has been investigated for the last 25 years or so. And particularly turning to kind of transcultural awareness, I've done studies with various colleagues and in different settings. So for example, in Iran or in Japan and in Thailand as well, and looking at how intercultural and transcultural awareness can be incorporated into English language teaching. Then we have intercultural citizenship education. So as I said, the model of kind of the idealized model that learners are aiming towards is an intercultural citizen rather than a native speaker. And again, there's lots of research into this, showing how it can be incorporated into language teaching and showing that it's an identity that students do first of all have and develop, but also one that they're interested in developing and something that motivates them to learn languages. Yeah, and it's a much more positive one than the native speaker, because as we all know, it's unless you change your nationality and change your cultural identity very fundamentally, you're never going to be a native speaker of English. Yeah, whereas an intercultural citizen is something that anyone who learns language and engages in intercultural communication can achieve. We also have concepts such as Emf Awareness, so particularly people like Nikos Sifakis and Yasmin Bayer have been working within European context in particular in this for the last 5 years or so. They've just finished a very large European Union funded project called Enrich, looking at this with teacher education. So this is really just educating teachers about what English as a lingua franca is, how English is used around the globe, how English relates to multilingualism, etc. And again, like I've been arguing here, it doesn't tell teachers what to do and tell them how they should teach in their class. Rather, it makes them aware of how English is used in a way that's very different to the kind of standardized native speaker model, and gives them kind of suggestions about how this can be incorporated into teaching practices in different ways. Most recently, we have Emf Awareness. So this has been worked on by my colleague, Tomo Ishikawa. Yeah, and this kind of combines both the Emf awareness, but also an awareness of transcultural communication and also of transmodality and translanguaging, and emphasizes the multilingual and multicultural and multimodal processes that go into communicating. And again, he's conducted various empirical studies on teaching this in Japan, yeah, with a lot of success so far. And then lastly, we have what's really gathered pace over the last 10 years or so, which is globally oriented ELT approaches. So what Galloway and Rose referred to as GELT, so Global English Language Teaching. Yeah, and there's been extensive empirical studies over the last 5 to 10 years, including work that I know people are doing at PSU, that I know Yusuf is doing, looking at how global Englishes can influence English language teaching. Yeah, and again, we're seeing positive changes here. So I would like to just emphasize again that I think lots of this transcultural approach to ELT is not something particularly revolutionary. It's pursuing what are already considered good language teaching practices in general. So as I said, it's not a big change in ELT, rather it's just a continuation and emphasizing things that are already underway and kind of trying to draw them all together as one approach to ELT. Okay, so to conclude, so what is transcultural communication? So transcultural communication is interactions in which participants move through and across rather than between cultural and linguistic boundaries with multiple scales simultaneously present. So thus the idea of named languages and cultures can no longer be taken for granted, and in the processes, borders between languages and cultures become blurred, transgressed, and transcended. And why should we, or why do we need this? So I would argue that transcultural communication opens up new directions in how we think about and research and teach the English language, culture, and communication. And it does it in a manner that avoids stereotyping and what I've referred to as methodological nationalism. that's still deeply embedded in both intercultural communication research and especially within English language teaching. So for teaching, transcultural ELT represents an extension of current good practices in language and culture pedagogy rather than a revolution. It means adopting a critical approach to language, culture, communication, and any other categories we might use. It's a focus on the processes of language use and learning rather than fixed forms and practices. It's an emphasis on local contexts and cultures and local uses of language. It involves the development of inter and transcultural awareness and English as a multilingual Franca awareness. The global and intercultural citizen becomes the model and aim of language teaching rather than the native speaker of the language. And importantly, teachers may adopt different elements of transcultural ELT approaches depending on circumstances and preferences. Okay, so I think that's probably all I want to say for the moment. So I think the last thing we'll go on to is the discussion task. So hopefully you've all got the handout that I think Yusuf sent around earlier. So I thought what would be helpful to get us thinking about some of these issues in more detail is to look at an example. And again, I think Chitama will recognize this example well. So this is again an example from her earlier study that we then wrote about in a later paper. So this is, as I said, from this earlier study of international students in the UK and their interactions on Facebook. Excuse me. So in this example, we have a Facebook exchange between Ken, whose first language is Thai, and Hissam, whose first language is Farsi, and he's Iranian. So Ken posts the following on Hissam's wall. So as you can probably see there, there's a photo here of anyone who's familiar with martial arts, we know that's Jet Li. And so Ken has posted a picture of Jet Li next to a quotation from Bruce Lee. So again, if you know your martial arts, you'll know that Bruce Lee was a famous martial arts star from the 1960s and 70s, whereas Jet Li is perhaps more contemporary. And he's included this quotation from Bruce Lee and then very obviously crossed out the Bruce and written Jet Li next to it. Now, he's done this as part of an ongoing exchange Ken and Hissam have where they tease each other. So Hissam is a fan of Bruce Lee, is a fan of Jet Li, but does not like Bruce Lee. So Ken likes to tease or annoy or to make jokes with Hissam about Jet Li and Bruce Lee and about which one is better. So he's deliberately put the two quotations next to each other and crossed out Bruce Lee's quotation and replaced it with Jet Li to try and get a response from Hissam, which is successful. So Hissam does rise to this and responds in the following way. Now, I'm not going to talk about this one because this is what I'd like you to discuss. So hopefully you can all see this on your sheet. So what I'd like you to do is to look at this example, read through the Facebook exchange that follows, and think about the following questions when you're reading through that. So what are the relationships between language, English and any other languages present, and culture in this example? Yep, so what languages can you see, or can you even distinguish between the languages, and what cultures are there, and how do they relate to language or not, as the case may be? What cultural and other identities are adopted or constructed by participants in this example? Yeah, and then thinking about your own experiences, do you have similar experiences that might lead you to question links between languages, culture, and identities? And lastly, what, if any, do you think are the implications for language teaching? Yep, so if you're teaching language or learning language, what implications do you think this kind of communication has for how you might teach or learn the language? Okay, so I don't know if people want to split up into smaller groups for this or whether they want to discuss it individually.
I think it seems like we are running out of time at the moment. Maybe is it possible to discuss here? I think it's maybe better.
Okay, all right, yeah, but I think maybe it would be good to give people 5 minutes or so to read through it and think about the questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we do that? Should we give everyone 5 minutes to read through it? Yes,
for 5 minutes, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and then we'll discuss it together. That sounds good.
And actually I already posted the handout for discussion already. in the chat box, so everyone can download there actually.
All right, excellent.
There is a question in the chat. So for now, you can read through the sample of the extract, and after we are going to discuss together.
Okay, I think that's about 5 minutes, is it? So I don't know if people want to post some of their thoughts in the chat, or to also to raise their hand and to talk about them. If we go on to the questions again. Maybe it's a bit of a tough question. I think perhaps the most interesting question for me anyway is the third and the fourth one. So whether people feel that they have similar experiences. So the kinds of communications or the examples of communication that I've been showing here, which I refer to as transcultural. Yeah, for me, I think they're very common and very normal, but I do sometimes wonder if it's just me. So do other people feel they have similar experiences? Is this something that's part of your everyday interactions, or do you feel something different?
I think there is a comment in the chat box from Nantana Sitirak, I guess.
Just looking at that now, yeah. Okay, yeah. So for this example, what I think we see. So maybe if I just quickly go through a summary of it. So I think, as Nantana said, yes, certainly Hissam is a fan of martial arts stars. So in terms of identity, I think what is interesting there is that the expert in martial arts and actually the linguistic expert is Hissam, who is Iranian, whose first language is Farsi, whose second language is English. So in terms of his background, you wouldn't necessarily predict that he'd be an expert in Chinese or martial arts. But of course, as we know, there's no reason why he couldn't be, because martial arts is a global phenomenon. Jet Li and Bruce Lee are both global movie stars. Mm. So what you see is very clearly the way that people can adopt identities related to perhaps cultural practices that they wouldn't necessarily be ascribed to based on simplistic and nationalistic affiliations for culture. And I find the bit on line 4 particularly interesting. Okay, so I think Phil Moore's just made a comment about intangible culture, yeah. So making a joke about these personalities could be equated with making a joke of the society where these personalities belong. I guess so. Although I think in this example, I don't think either. I mean, what is interesting is that there is no national association with this. So it's talking about martial arts cultures, which isn't particularly associated with any national culture. So I think nation isn't really a category that's relevant here. But certainly there's teasing, yeah. So Ken is teasing Hassan, was also teasing Ken. And I think it's interesting that on line 4, you have the linguistic expertise of Hissam here. So he says the family name needs to be corrected. It should read Li instead of Li, so L-I instead of L-E-E. Now, my understanding is, and I'm not an expert in Putonghua or Cantonese, but my understanding is Li L-I is the transliteration of Putonghua for the surname Li, and Li double-E is the Cantonese transliteration of the surname Li. So Hissam has quite an in-depth degree of linguistic knowledge here, but again, you wouldn't necessarily predict if you took simplistic categories of the languages that he speaks or is proficient in. But again, I think we can say, you know, it may well be that Hassam doesn't speak any Cantonese or Putonghua at all. Yeah, I don't think that's something you asked him about in the interviews, was it? So we don't know for sure, but I assume he probably isn't fluent in either of these languages, but he has the knowledge here. But it shows quite clearly that it's not easy to associate this particular linguistic resource or whatever with any particular language. So is Li Chinese, is it Putonghua or Cantonese Chinese, or is it something else? Yeah, I think that's a very clear example of translanguaging there. Okay, but as I said, I think the most interesting question for me is whether people have their own experiences of this. So is transcultural communication something that people feel they've experienced, or do you think that cross-cultural or intercultural communication approaches better describe your experiences? Okay, so I think Nantana has written here that she didn't get the joke. The meaning is based on their context. Yes, so very definitely, it's funny for them. For us, we can read it, but it wouldn't make us laugh. So yeah, certainly humor is very context-based. And I can understand why it's humorous for them, because they have the teasing about martial arts and about Jet and Bruce Lee. But yes, I mean, it certainly wouldn't make me laugh out loud, but I guess it made them laugh. Yeah, so film was written, yeah, the joke is contextual and cultural too. Yeah, I guess, but in terms of culture, what culture? So I think this shows very clearly that it's not any kind of national culture. The cultures referred to here are movie stars, so Jet and Bruce Lee, martial arts cultures, etc. But they're not associated with any one country or place. Yeah, and as I said before, what I find really interesting is that Hassam takes this identity as the expert in martial arts. So he has a lot of knowledge about Jet Li. So we've talked already about the linguistic knowledge, and then there's on lines 6 to 9. Yeah, he knows all about Jet Li's background. Yeah, he was the champion of China from the age of 11 to 9. Yeah, and then he obviously has some knowledge of martial arts. So on line 9, he talks about the cannon. I think he means cannon fist punch, but he calls it the cannon fist punch. Yeah, which is a martial arts term. Yeah, but then clarifies that it is a joke in line 10. Yeah, with a bit of British English, so it uses the term mate at the end of it. Okay, so I think maybe for the last few minutes, it would be good to see if there are any questions or comments people have. So I'll just go through. Yep. Okay, so I think, yeah, we've got, if I'm right, Yusuf, we've got about another 5 minutes or so. So just to say thank you, Kopkun Clap, and to see, are there any comments or questions people have in general?
Are there any further questions? All right. There is more comment there in the chat box. So clearly the case of language English constructing culture is Chinese.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd agree with you there, Fillmore. I think, okay, if we go back to that example, I'll just pull the example up. I'm not sure I'd agree 100% with that. So the language on the surface looks like English, but actually it's not just English. So first of all, it's clearly not standard British English, even though the two participants are based in the UK. So yeah, if you look at line 2, I am gone, kill you. Yep, so that could be seen as an error, but it's not, so from an English as a lingua franca perspective, it wouldn't be seen as an error because it doesn't cause any problems in communication. Ken responds immediately with "you are very welcome," so with a winking smile, so clearly understood him perfectly. So it's not standard English, so it's English used as a lingua franca. And then we have this discussion of Lee and Lee. Yeah, no, that's not English. Yeah, so nobody in the UK, well, actually, quite a lot of people in the UK have the surname Lee, people who are British Asians, but it wouldn't be part of standard English, the surname Lee. Then you've got cannon, feast, punch. Again, that's not an English phrase. So I would question whether it's English. And they're certainly not constructing Chinese culture. I think they're constructing, Sam is constructing martial arts culture. So he's talking about martial arts and his knowledge of Jet Li. But he doesn't, at no point does he associate it, sorry, he does. At one point he associates it with China on line 7, talking about his background. But Jet Li became globally famous, not from being the champion of China. He became globally famous through his movies. First of all, through his movies in Hong Kong, and then through his Hollywood movies. So Jet Li is a very good example of, as many movie stars are, of a kind of global cultural phenomenon that may have his origins in one particular place, but has transcended those origins a long time ago.
I think there is a question in the chat box. Yes. I found the term EMF somewhere. It is being tried to replace ELF somehow.
Okay, yes, that's a good question. Certainly for me, it's not a replacement for ELF, no. It's, I mean, that is, I think what EMF is attempting to emphasize is, and quite rightly, that multilingualism comes before English. So English as a lingua franca is typically used in multilingual scenarios. So that's why the term EMF has been proposed, but it's not supposed to replace ELF. So it's just supposed to change the emphasis of ELF. So the term ELF is already well established. And I think as long as we recognize that it's part of multilingualism, then I think ELF is fine as a term. And Jennifer Jenkins, in her original paper where she proposes the term EMF, makes it very clear that she doesn't want to change the terminology. She just wants the emphasis to change and to have more recognition of ELF as being part of multilingualism rather than the other way around. Excuse me. Is that Gig, by the way? Hiding there?
Yes,
it really is a Southampton reunion.
It can be clearly seen that, teaching English in Thailand, we're teaching English as a foreign language, right? And however, in our practice, in our daily life situation, we normally use English as a lingua franca. So, my question is that, to what extent do you agree or disagree to implement English as a lingua franca or global Englishes or the world Englishes concept into the classroom?
Yeah, so I think they should very definitely be integrated into the classroom, because I think they offer a much more empowering model to students and to teachers. Yeah, I think as you've shown in your own research, Yusuf, that students and teachers have very, or particularly students, can have very positive attitudes towards English as a lingua franca, and for obvious reasons, because it removes the impossible kind of goal of the native speaker and replaces it with a very achievable goal. And it reflects the reality of people's communication, in that using English for intercultural communication is English used as a lingua franca in a multilingual scenario, in a multicultural scenario. So what you would be teaching would be reflecting how people actually use the language.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I would very strongly argue that that's what we need to incorporate into teaching. But of course, how we incorporate into teaching is not an easy question. We don't just do research and then it immediately changes classroom practices. There's obviously, you know, there are pedagogic approaches, there are restrictions on teachers, there are particular motivations that they have or students have. So it's a two-way process.
I think from my experience, one thing which is very challenging to Thai scholars or teachers is that when we would like to teach or implement English as a lingua franca into the teaching practices, we still have lacking of like teaching materials. So it's really difficult to decide the teaching material that can reflect the English as a lingua franca and more Englishes.
Yes, no, I understand that. Yeah, but I think maybe one of the problems is that in terms of producing textbooks and things, I don't think many researchers would be comfortable with English as a lingua franca textbook, because the point is that it's highly variable and it's locally contextualized. So I think it's local. What most people would argue is that teachers need to make their own materials, yeah, because they're best placed to decide what is most relevant for their context. Mm-hmm. So certainly I wouldn't, I think a textbook that perhaps was published by Oxford University Press that was supposed to go around the globe teaching English as a lingua franca would be very problematic. It would have all the same problems as a textbook that was based on Anglophone English, in that it would have our particular fixed model of English that was supposedly relevant to all contexts, which would be a problem. The whole point is that it's language used in variable ways based on the particular needs and settings in which it's used. So I think it's best decided by local teachers.
Right. There are two more questions, I think, in the chat. We're running out of time, so it depends on you, Will. Would you like to give a quick answers for that two questions, please?
Okay, yeah, let me have a look. So how should English teachers, this is from Muslim, hi Muslim, how should English teachers deal with language ideologies, cultural representations embedded in ELT textbooks? Do you have any suggestions? Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I think ELT textbooks are a good way of exploring language ideologies. So you can get students to look at it, look at the representations of culture and to explore them critically. So rather than just accept them, look at what's there. I think, does it match their experiences? So if they see a representation of their own culture, is that how they would choose to represent their culture? Or look at what's missing. So what's not there? Yeah, again, if their own culture is missing, why is it missing and how would they include it? So I think as long as we approach it critically, ELT materials, even ones that are very kind of normative and Anglophone based, can be useful for teaching a kind of critical approach to culture and getting students to explore what's there and what's not there and what they might do differently. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Bill. I think it's time, right, Dr. Yusuf?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker, for your talk today. I believe everyone found it very interesting. So given that the use of English as lingua franca, multilingual franca, for intercultural and transcultural communication has become normal part in our daily lives. So it's very important to look into the situation critically. All right. So throughout, as we can see, throughout the presentation, Associate Professor Dr. Will show us a range of theoretical debates on global global Englishes, English as a lingua franca, intercultural communication, language and cultures, relationships in intercultural communication and global Englishes, for example, and some empirical data of research studies, which are very interesting and useful, I think. So as will research interests are particularly related to intercultural and transcultural communication. So I would like to show you some of his recent book publications, right? So can I share my screen?
Yes, I've stopped sharing mine.
So here are, can you see the screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So here are some example of his book publications recently. So he has published, the recent one is 2021, wow, English Medium Instruction Trans-Language Practices in Asia, and also this the same in this year, no, 2021 Transcultural Communication through Global Englishes and Advanced Textbook for Students, with Ikisawa, right? Do I pronounce it right?
Yes, yeah.
Ichihawa. Okay, and in 2018, also the roughly Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, and also in 2015, Cultures and Identity through English as a Lingua Franca, with thinking concepts and goals in intercultural communications. So you can, if you want to look into further details, and you can look to these books, okay, to read more. Okay. And also, I think you have you are also the co-editor of the book series Developments in English as a Lingua Franca, BGM, and Cambridge Elements in Intercultural Communication, Cambridge University Press as well. Okay, so as such, we can see from empirical data samples, we can see and consider different L practices in transcultural communication. Okay, so I think it's time. So I would like to thank you again, Bill. All right, and so if there is no more question, it's time. So we would like to thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Will Baker, so much again to share your interesting information and these emerging themes in current transcultural communication, intercultural phenomena. Okay, so before we leave the meeting, may I now invite you all to provide us the feedback according to the link in the chat box. So your feedback can help us to improve our activity in the future. So after you complete the evaluation form, you will need to click another link at the bottom and fill your name and email address. All right, and the participation certificate will be sent directly to your email. All right. Okay, so I think all right, the links is there already. So thank you very much, Will, and also everyone for your participation today. And oh, okay, before I forget, we are going to have the next event. Okay, I need to share you again. Okay, the next event will be Evolving Writer Identities for Academics Publishing in Applied Linguistics, all right, by Associate Professor Dr. Jim McKinley. All right. Okay, And okay, so hopefully to see many of you there again. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. So that is the end of the session today. Hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Bye for now. Thank you very much, Will, and hope to see you again. And thank you very much, everyone, for your actively participation for today's session.